In late October 2025, the most expensive warship ever built received an unusual order. The USS Gerald R. Ford, a 100,000-ton nuclear-powered aircraft carrier worth $13 billion, was pulled out of a port call in Split, Croatia, and ordered to sail. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth had reassigned the carrier strike group from European Command to United States Southern Command, known as SOUTHCOM. The official reason was drug trafficking. But once you understand what the Ford really represents in the American naval inventory, the deployment starts looking less like a counter-narcotics mission and more like the opening move of something much larger. The order came down on October 24th. Within weeks, the Ford strike group had sailed through the Strait of Gibraltar, across the Atlantic, and into the SOUTHCOM area of responsibility on November 11th. It entered the Caribbean Sea through the Anegada Passage on November 16th, moving through waters east and south of Puerto Rico, within operational reach of the Venezuelan coastline. To understand why that mattered, you have to understand what this ship actually is. The USS Gerald R. Ford is the lead vessel of an entirely new class of American supercarrier. It is the first new aircraft carrier design in 40 years. The hull stretches more than 1,100 feet in length, longer than 3 football fields. It uses an electromagnetic catapult system known as EMALS, which allows the flight deck to launch everything from heavy F/A-18EF Super Hornet strike fighters down to small reconnaissance drones. The other 10 aircraft carriers in the United States fleet cannot do that. They use older steam catapults that were designed for a much narrower range of aircraft. The Ford was built around a single specification: speed of sortie generation, the rate at which the carrier can launch aircraft, recover them, refuel them, rearm them, and put them back into the air. The Ford is engineered to generate roughly 25% more daily sorties than the Nimitz-class carriers it is replacing. When the Gerald R. Ford deployed to the Caribbean, it did not arrive alone. Carrier Air Wing 8 came aboard, including F/A-18EF Super Hornet strike fighters, EA-18G Growlers for electronic warfare, E-2D Advanced Hawkeyes for airborne early warning, MH-60, Romeo and Sierra helicopters for anti-submarine work and search and rescue, and C-2A Greyhound aircraft for logistics. Around the carrier itself, 3 Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyers formed a defensive screen: the USS Mahan, the USS Winston S. Churchill, and the USS Bainbridge. Each of those destroyers carried dozens of vertical launch cells loaded with Tomahawk cruise missiles, standard missiles for air defense, and anti-submarine torpedoes. Together, this force represented the largest American naval concentration in the Caribbean Sea since the early 1990s. The strategic question becomes obvious almost immediately. You do not send a force like this to chase fishing-sized smuggling boats. The Pentagon named the operation Operation Southern Spear, announced by Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth around November 13, 2025. He framed it as a campaign against narco-terrorist organizations operating across the Caribbean and the Eastern Pacific. Southern Command Commander Admiral Alvin Holsey described the deployment as a mission to protect the Western Hemisphere and the safety of the American homeland. Since early September 2025, American forces had been striking small vessels accused of moving cocaine through the region. By the time the Ford arrived in mid-November 2025, that count had climbed to roughly 20 boat strikes. This is where the operational logic of using a supercarrier begins to break down. The Ford alone costs millions of dollars per day to operate. Its full strike group, with all the destroyers, supply oilers, air-wing aircraft, and personnel factored in, runs significantly higher. Sending a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier to interdict fishing boat-sized vessels was similar to using a Lamborghini to deliver pizzas. The math did not justify the mission. United States Coast Guard cutters, P-8 Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft, and existing Southern Command destroyers were already designed for that exact role. They were already conducting it. The Gerald R. Ford added nothing meaningful to the counter-narcotics fight that was not already being executed by smaller, cheaper, and more appropriate platforms. So why send the Ford at all? The strategic answer pointed directly at Caracas and at Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro. On November 24, 2025, the Trump administration formally designated the Cartel de los Soles, an organization the United States alleged was run by Maduro and his senior military officers, as a foreign terrorist organization. That designation does not by itself authorize military strikes inside Venezuela. Sanctions and legal experts pushed back on Defense Secretary Hegseth's framing that the designation created new options for kinetic action. What the foreign terrorist organization label did change was the political and legal framing of the entire operation. It moved the public narrative from drug enforcement to counter-terrorism. It pressured regional allies to treat the Maduro government as a hostile state criminal hybrid. And it gave the administration political cover for a more aggressive posture, even as the underlying legal authority for direct military action remained contested. The Gerald R. Ford was in the Caribbean because the boats had stopped being the actual point. This is the part of the deployment that rarely gets explained on cable news and in policy briefings. A carrier strike group operating within striking range of a hostile coastline does something specific to the political calculations inside that country. Defense analysts call it imposing dilemmas. The opposing government has to make decisions it does not want to make, on a timeline it does not control, with information it does not have. Venezuela's military, on paper, operated Russian-supplied S-300V air defense systems and a small fleet of Sukhoi Su-30 Mk2 multi-role fighters based at airfields like El Libertador and Barcelona. Against Carrier Air Wing 8, the realistic assessment from defense analysts was that those systems would struggle badly. The 5 EA-18G Growlers aboard the Ford were specifically designed to degrade the kind of radar networks Venezuela operates, and the Super Hornet fleet outnumbered and outclassed what the Venezuelan Air Force could credibly put in the air. The destroyer's Tomahawk cruise missiles could reach military installations across the Venezuelan coastline from where the strike group was positioned in the southern Caribbean. None of this guaranteed a clean outcome in a real engagement, but the imbalance was severe enough that every Venezuelan flag officer was doing the same calculation. President Maduro's government was well aware of this. So was every senior officer in his armed forces, and that created the actual strategic effect of the deployment. The Ford's presence forced every Venezuelan general to ask a quiet question every morning. If Washington pulls the trigger, am I going down with this regime, or do I have another option? That single question, asked at scale across an entire officer corps, is how authoritarian regimes start to crack. The United States had executed this exact playbook before. American carriers off Cuba during the missile crisis in 1962. The Nimitz-class deployment off Panama prior to Operation Just Cause in 1989. The carrier presence in the Persian Gulf in 1990 and again in 2003. The pattern was consistent across every case. The carrier did not have to fire. It had to be there long enough that the political situation on shore became untenable for the leadership being pressured. In military strategy circles, this is called compellence, the use of force or the credible threat of force to make an opponent do something they otherwise would not do. Where deterrence stops an action from happening, compellence forces an action to happen. The Gerald R. Ford was a compellence asset, and Caracas was the audience. If you find this kind of strategic breakdown useful, hit subscribe. New videos every week, all analyzing the decisions and assets shaping how modern conflicts actually unfold. Now back to why the carrier's clock was ticking from the day it arrived. The pressure window the Ford created was temporary by design. Carriers were never built to sit still. The Ford had already been at sea for an unusually long stretch before it ever received the order to head south. The earlier deployment from 2023 to 2024 had stretched to 239 days after 3 extensions, giving the Ford's crew recent experience with unusually long operational cycles. By the time the ship was redirected to the Caribbean in late 2025, that crew was already deep into another extended deployment. A nuclear-powered supercarrier requires constant maintenance. The reactors, the electromagnetic catapults, the arresting gear, the air-wing aircraft, every system runs on a usage clock. Every additional month at sea was a month subtracted from the next planned overhaul in dry dock at Newport News Shipbuilding. The Navy could extend the deployment, but it could not do so indefinitely. Every day the Ford remained in the Caribbean was a day the carrier was unavailable somewhere else in the world. That trade-off was not an abstract one. With only 11 carriers in the entire American fleet, and only 3 or 4 typically deployed at any given moment, parking the Ford in the southern Caribbean meant pulling capability away from the Pacific, the Mediterranean, and the Middle East at the same time. Step back from Venezuela for a moment, because the deployment was not really about Venezuela in isolation. Over the past 5 years, 3 nations had deepened their defense and intelligence cooperation with Caracas. Russia supplied the air defense systems and the Sukhoi fighters. China expanded economic and surveillance cooperation, including port and infrastructure investments. Iran provided drones and technical advisors. From the perspective of United States Southern Command, Venezuela had stopped being a regional concern and started being a foothold for adversarial powers in the Western Hemisphere. Sending the Gerald R. Ford was therefore a message broadcast to 3 audiences simultaneously. The first audience was Maduro himself. Step down, negotiate, or face the prospect of direct kinetic action against the infrastructure that kept his government in power. The second audience was the rest of Latin America. Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico had been navigating a careful position on Venezuela for years. The Ford signaled that Washington considered the hemisphere a primary security zone again, not a secondary one. The third audience was Moscow, Beijing, and Tehran. The message there was the most strategic of all. The United States could move its most advanced naval asset out of European waters into the Caribbean Sea in under 3 weeks and project air power across an entire country's coastline. Whatever ambitions those 3 rival powers held about establishing a foothold in the American hemisphere, the Ford deployment was the answer to those ambitions. This brings the deployment to its central tension. The Gerald R. Ford in the Caribbean was, in a real sense, a race against its own clock. The carrier could not stay forever, and the Navy could not keep burning deployment time, maintenance capacity, and air wing endurance indefinitely. But before that pressure window fully closed, the crisis moved from signaling into action. On January 3, 2026, around 2 in the morning local time, American forces launched Operation Absolute Resolve. The operation involved more than 150 aircraft drawn from roughly 20 bases across the Western Hemisphere, a multi-domain force package coordinating air, naval, and special operations elements across the Caribbean theater. United States military aircraft bombed air defense infrastructure across northern Venezuela, while an apprehension force struck Nicolas Maduro's compound in Caracas. By dawn, Nicolas Maduro and his wife Celia Flores had been captured. The extraction force moved them out of Caracas by helicopter, initially transferring them to the USS Iwo Jima before they were flown to New York, where they entered federal custody at the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn. They were indicted on narco-terrorism, drug trafficking, and money laundering charges, and on January 5th they pleaded not guilty in Manhattan federal court. That same day, Vice President Delcy Rodriguez was sworn in as Venezuela's interim president before the National Assembly in Caracas, denouncing the operation as a kidnapping while assuming the duties of the office. The Ford was not the only platform involved, and it was not where Maduro was first shown in custody. But its arrival in the Caribbean was part of the wider force posture that made the operation credible, giving Washington naval air power, electronic warfare capacity, and a visible coercive presence near Venezuela before the raid began. Carrier deployments rarely cause regime change on their own, but the Ford's presence contributed to the regional pressure environment around the operation, narrowed the timeline available to Maduro, and turned what began as a counter-narcotics mission into a regime-level crisis. After the operation, the Ford was redirected away from the Caribbean toward the Middle East as the Iran situation escalated. In March of 2026, a fire broke out in the ship's laundry compartment while the Ford was operating in support of those Middle East operations in the Red Sea. The fire caused injuries and smoke-related medical treatment, but the carrier's propulsion was not affected and the ship remained operational. By April, the Ford had broken the longest carrier deployment record since the Vietnam War. Reports from inside the Navy described mounting burnout among aviation personnel. Defense Secretary Hegseth ordered a formal review of attrition rates among Navy strike fighter squadrons. The Ford had moved on, but the precedent it helped set behind it had not. So when you see the Pentagon discuss drug boats and narco-terrorist networks, understand what was actually happening underneath that language. The most expensive warship in the American arsenal was not sent to chase fishing vessels. The Gerald R. Ford was sent to compress a political timeline inside Venezuela, to reassert American military primacy across the Western Hemisphere, and to put three rival great powers on notice that the Caribbean is, and remains, an American sea. The carrier did not have to be the platform that carried out the raid to help support those objectives. Its mere presence, parked off the Venezuelan coast with carrier Air Wing 8 on the flight deck and 3 Arleigh Burke destroyers on its flanks, was the message itself. The deployment has now moved on. The Ford has been pulled into other commitments, in other oceans, against other adversaries. But the strategic signal it sent to Caracas, Moscow, Beijing, and Tehran has not faded. The question is not whether the Ford was meant to change the calculus inside Venezuela. It was. The question is how much of what followed was shaped by the carrier's presence, how much was already underway behind closed doors, and what precedent Washington has now created by turning naval pressure into a direct political outcome.